You got barbecue back there, and you didn't invite me. Hurt my feelings.
What is good? Welcome back to another Destination Dynasty Quick Hits episode, part 2 of quarterback efficiency based on fantasy production created for their wide receivers. Don't miss part 1 that was posted last week. And a couple weeks ago, I did the podcast on DD Radio that talked about this entire episode and is what these last 2 episodes of DD Quick Hits is based on. If you've not already, like and subscribe to the channel, ddfantasyfootball.com. As you see on the screen, get access to the Trinity Tracker and the War Tool, 2 of the best tools in the fantasy space to help you dominate your dynasty leagues. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the quarterback buys. And again, to set the stage for this episode, this is based on not just the quarterbacks themselves being buys for dynasty, but we're going to take a look at their offenses as well. How does the quarterback production and the way that the offenses were deployed last year lead to you wanting to maybe buy into these offenses in 2025? So we're going to go ahead and get started with buy number 1. It is Brock Purdy. So Brock Purdy was 10th in fantasy points per game last year. He's quarterback 13 on Keep Trade Cut, 38th overall if you're looking at overall dynasty ranks without tight end premium. So keep that in mind if you're looking these up. But he was QB 10 last year. But then you look at what else did he do for his offense specifically, or what did the offense do for the receivers around him? So let's talk about his neutral pass rate. It was 13th. And when you look at neutral pass rate, you're deciding between win probabilities between 20 and 80%. How frequently is the team passing? So the Niners, while they're not the most aggressive offense, they still do want to throw the ball more than they want to run the ball, which is interesting because I think a lot of people would pigeonhole them as a running first team or a very balanced team. Maybe that was the Christian McCaffrey injury, but who knows? You know, with Deebo Samuel gone, I do wonder if maybe they start shifting the offense into a little bit of a different direction. So they were 13th in neutral pass rate. Brock Purdy himself, when you're measuring EPA plus CPOE, that is how I measure efficiency for this individual quarterback. So Brock Purdy was pretty good. So he was also an efficient passer. So these are the 3 things. Obviously, some fantasy upside, and I see 13th in rushing points contributed. So of his fantasy points, he was 13th. And this is out of 44 qualifying quarterbacks that had at least 150 attempts. I made an exception for Michael Penix, even though I'm not going to talk about him. I threw him in the sample size. But it's out of 44 quarterbacks. So these numbers rank out of 44. So these are the things I'm looking for. Brock Purdy is on a pass-first offense, more passing than running. He is 9th in efficiency, and he's 13th in rushing points. So right there, that kind of screams to me that quarterback 10 is a fair projection, regardless of who the weapons are. If he's got Kyle Shanahan, he still has a couple of the weapons that he's had in the past. He's actually a pretty good buy at quarterback 13. Now, it doesn't mean he has an extreme ceiling, but if you remember last week's episode where I talked about Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow. Now, is he better than those guys? No, but if you told me I could pick up a second starter or a significant piece, maybe a first or a skill player worth a first on top of Brock Purdy for one of those QBs, I'd probably want to do it. So let's take a look at their offense as a whole. So if you just look at the offense as a whole for the 49ers, so 11th in fantasy points created for the offense. This is removing touchdowns. So I'm not counting the touchdowns here. Touchdowns can be a little fluky. Now, obviously, better offenses on better teams are going to score more touchdowns. But when you remove them, how many receiving or passing fantasy points are being created in the offense? The Niners were 11th, okay? I put the neutral pass rate on there as well. Always highlights how that affects both the quarterback themselves and the team, since Brock Purdy is going to get the majority of quarterback snaps, if not all of them, if he doesn't get injured. Drop back EPA per play. So again, this is when the team passes overall, not just Brock Purdy, but when the team passes, they were still 9th. Now, obviously, if he plays most of the snaps, that's going to stay pretty consistent. But what this is actually measuring is how good is the team on passing downs. Not how efficient Brock Purdy is as a quarterback, but how good is the team when they pass. So this also tells me that they don't have a reason to back off that pass rate or think Brock Purdy should pass less because of his efficiency. They're actually getting really, really good results with the drop back EPA when they throw the ball. and then 27th in play rate. So this is the one bugaboo with the Niners offense, is probably, to an extent, this is just my assumption, to maintain what they've maintained with Brock Purdy, they're probably running at a slightly lower rate, not the neutral pass rate. Neutral pass rate is talking about when the game is not in the balance, so it's still competitive, between 20 and 80% win probability is the default. They're throwing more often than they're running. But the play rate is just measuring how many plays they're running per game. So even though the splits can be one thing, how often you're doing it, how fast you're going is another thing. Now, you could argue that without Christian McCaffrey last year, they maybe played slower because they were higher than this in years past. So it's a push and pull, but I think that's the one thing where if you told me it stays the same, it just means his efficiency is going to have to be the same or better for him to probably deliver numbers higher than what he did last year. I still think at QB 10, he's a pretty good buy. Let's take a look at the Trinity scores for the 49ers. So if we pull up the 49ers, there we are. These are the 49ers skill players from last year that highlight. Obviously, the main ones are on the board. And remember, Trinity is measuring their usage within the offense. So you're looking at George Kittle, Juwan Jennings, Brandon Ayuk. This line right here, just so everybody knows how to read the Trinity, this is the regression line for points per game is over here. Trinity score is down here. So obviously, the higher Trinity score, the more they're doing within the offense to do the stuff that creates fantasy points. And then what you're doing is measuring it against this line. Were they above or below that? Now, typically a rule of thumb that Ray and I have looked at over the last couple years with Trinity is when you are higher above the line, typically you see guys that are just really good. They may not be way out here because that's going to be more determined on their usage. But when you see a player like, for instance, George Kittle, his Trinity for the season only 6.64. But if you look at the fantasy production above what was expected, way above the line. So that's telling me that basically George Kittle, even with his usage, is doing a lot more with it than your average tight end that would get that usage. So I said that the Niners players were a buy, and obviously you can pull these up team by team. It updates when a player moves teams or when a player comes to a team. So when you go back and look, it does change the players' names that were on the team if they go to another team. But you can see the weapons, obviously Kittle, Jennings, Ayuk. We'll see if Ayuk gets traded. Here's Ricky Pearsall down here. Now, this is for the full season. If you filter this for the second half of the season, obviously it's different for Ricky Pearsall. He came on at the end. But even with his usage early, when it wasn't much, it was still above that regression line. So that's good to see. But back to the 49ers. I mean, Brock Purdy at quarterback 13, I put their offense as a buy. Now, you can decide which weapons you want to buy, whether it's Pearsall, whether it's Ayuk, whether it's Jennings, whether it's Kittle. If you think one of those guys is going to get moved, if you think they draft a receiver, if they bring in a third receiver, heck, maybe it's somebody that we haven't even talked about. But given these numbers, Brock Purdy at quarterback 13 is a good buy, and I still think, despite Deebo Samuel getting traded, that the offense as a whole is a great buy for the weapons, depending on what price you get them at. Next up, we have Kyler Murray. Now, this is one that might be a little controversial. I think that Kyler Murray has been a little bit overhated by the community because everyone talked about, man, he's getting Marvin Harrison, who is supposed to be this generational wide receiver. And then last year, Marvin Harrison isn't generational. He's good. He's fine. He's probably a top 24, top 15 to 24 receiver, but he didn't absolutely break the league like people expected. Then you said, well, Kyler has a top 3 tight end with Trey McBride, right? And he didn't smash. And part of it was the fantasy community saw Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison and said, we've seen Kyler Murray with this extremely high ceiling before. He has to just put everything together. And basically he could be Lamar Jackson. He could be Jalen Hurts. He could be the quarterback that everyone was getting outside of the top 6 that finished QB2. And that just didn't happen. But he was still a top 12 QB in his quote-unquote down season, right? Kyler Murray was 12th in points per game. Here's where it gets interesting, though, because speaking of, we know Kyler has rushing upside. You can see 9th in rushing percentage of fantasy points, right? So we already know that. That's already built in. We know he's going to rush for a certain amount of yards. He's going to rush for some touchdowns. He's going to contribute more than your average quarterback on the ground. But then you look at the passing stuff, the stuff that people go, this guy's just not a good NFL quarterback. The data says differently. So they were 5th in neutral pass rate. That tells me the Cardinals want to throw the ball. So there you go. And there's more passing stats you can look at, but these are enough to kind of draw some of these sweeping conclusions. 5th in neutral pass rate. So then you look at, well, what did Kyler do with a team that was 5th in neutral pass rate? He was still 15th in passing efficiency. Go look at the rbsdm.com is where I pull all this data. There'll be some quarterbacks you think are way better passers than Kyler that are below him. So still, is he at the very top of the league? No. But he's still 15th. That's pretty good out of a sample size of 44. So right there, Kyler Murray as a fantasy asset at quarterback 14, like I would look at him and say QB 12, as long as he's healthy, that's probably his low end. I'm willing to bet right back that Kyler Murray is QB 6 to 10. Now, can he have a top 3 season again? Top 5 season? I'm not saying I'm betting on that because the top of the landscape is way different than when he did that 3 years ago. But now I'm willing to bet that he could go above this. And I think this quarterback 14 price signifies that, guess what? People are actually having Kyler Murray fatigue to the point where it's like, oh man, he's not going to be a quarterback for that long. He's not that good, blah, blah, blah. I'm not buying into that. I think he's a great buy at quarterback 14. Let's take a look at his weapons. So for the Cardinals themselves, here we go. 15th in points created for the weapons, right? So even though the narrative is Kyler's good for himself, he still has maybe top 12 floor. He's not good for the rest of the offense. Well, let's look at some of these numbers. 15th in passing points created. That's fine. That's okay. 5th in neutral pass rate. We already know that. Talked about that on the last slide. 13th in drop back EPA. So you're sitting here thinking, okay, they're passing the ball with the 5th highest neutral pass rate. They're 13th in the league in effectiveness when they pass. And then you look at the play rate, 21st. So this is a poorer version of what we saw with San Francisco, right? And so for that reason, I'm then going over to the Trinity, and I'm going to look at the Arizona Cardinals for last year. And here we go. Cardinals. You see Trey McBride way up here. So Trey McBride for the season had the top Trinity on the Cardinals, not even close. But if you look at where he was, pretty much expected based on his usage. Then you look at Marvin Harrison, 6.59 Trinity, very good for a rookie. Don't let people tell you otherwise. That's very good for a rookie. It's not elite. It's not the best of the best of the best, but it's really, really good. Below the regression line, though. Okay. Go down a step further. Michael Wilson, 4.74 Trinity. Okay. He's a roster clogger receiver, probably. He's fine. But again, below the regression line. Down here, Greg Dortch, a couple other peripheral weapons, Elijah Higgins. Point is, the reason I'm maybe, and this is a hot take, and you can always check out the Cardinals Trinity for yourself, I have the Cardinals weapons as a sell. Not because I don't think Kyler Murray can produce 2 good weapons. I mean, ultimately, it's Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison, right? But I do think that he's not a quarterback that I'm looking at. Like, he's not Brock Purdy in terms of what Brock Purdy can do for the weapons. And the reason that I say sell is because those guys are expensive, right? Like, it's a concentrated offense right now. It's Trey McBride. It's Marvin Harrison. Neither of them are cheap. Marv is still going to cost you top 12 receiver numbers. Trey McBride is going to cost you a ton to buy because there's just so few tight ends that matter. So for that reason, Kyler's a buy. Kyler is better than what I think a lot of people perceive him to be for his offense. But the weapons, given their prices, I have to say that they're a sell. So let's take a look at the next team. We have Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars. Now, I'm using Tampa Bay numbers for these because obviously the new head coach of the Jaguars is coming from the Buccaneers. The Jags were slightly lower in a couple numbers, which I'll mention, but I'm using Liam Cohen's offensive numbers from last year, aside for the things that I'll mention specifically. So Trevor Lawrence himself, quarterback 23. But if you look at Baker Mayfield and where he slotted in, Baker Mayfield was a top 6 quarterback in fantasy points. So I'm not saying that Trevor Lawrence is Baker Mayfield. I think it's a little unfair to just say, well, he's automatically just going to be what Baker Mayfield was, right? Like, that's not fair. But I also don't think you can say Trevor Lawrence is quarterback 23 or he's not that good or he's not as good as Baker. In fact, it's probably a pretty apt comparison to say, look what Baker Mayfield did when he got Liam Cohen, and now Liam Cohen is going to the Jaguars. The Buccaneers last year were 15th in neutral pass rate. So again, a kind of balanced team, right? Like even lower than the Niners and the Cardinals. Now you wouldn't have thought it because you go, oh, Baker threw it a ton. You know, Baker was a huge contributor to fantasy points throwing the ball. But still, when they had the decision to make, they were not super high in neutral pass rate, which is good. That's actually more sustainable. And it's probably meaning that you're getting something out of your running game to where you're not just throwing. Like that's a hard way to live when you're living in that Mahomes and Burrow territory where it's 65% of the time you're throwing. Even if the run game is good, you have to have a really special quarterback to be able to maintain a neutral pass rate of that high. Now, Trevor Lawrence's EPA and CPOE, so his personal quarterback efficiency here, low. Baker Mayfield's good. Top 10. So I'm, again, not making that comparison, but if you're taking Trevor Lawrence's efficiency, and it hasn't always been this bad, he's had a year where he's been inside the top 15. He's had another year where he's been inside the top 10. So if you just give him a little bit of a bump, okay, maybe not Baker numbers, maybe not QB 8, but let's just put him comfortably inside the top 15 for quarterback efficiency. And then rushing percentage. This is why Trevor Lawrence isn't a bad buy, because he's always been able to contribute a decent amount of points on the ground. He was 16th last year in terms of his fantasy points percentage that was coming on the ground. So let's take a look at the Jaguars themselves. So last year, or this is last year using Buccaneers numbers, they were 4th in points created for the weapons. So Tampa Bay's offense last year was 4th in terms of points created for the passing game. Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Jalen McMillan, Cade Otton, the running backs in the receiving game. All combined, they had the 4th most possible points in the passing game. That hints towards that efficiency, right? Because they're not throwing it more than everybody, but we'll get to that here with the play rate. They have a middle-of-the-pack neutral play rate, but they're creating a ton of points for the offensive weapons. So then you look at the neutral pass rate, 15th, but let's skip over to that play rate, 6th. So this is kind of the opposite of what we've seen with the first two, right? The neutral pass rate is a little lower, but the play rate is way higher. So what that tells me is the Buccaneers last year were throwing it less in neutral situations, but they were playing faster, which again, that leads to what? Creating more points for the weapons, like the points created number where they were 4th. And then you look at their effectiveness as an offense when they drop back to pass. It was top 5. So all of this screams to me that I'm not saying Trevor Lawrence is going to have a Baker Mayfield resurgence where he is a top 6 fantasy quarterback. But I think he's kind of gotten this reputation as because he's not a difference maker like people expected when he was drafted. I mean, he was QB 6 before he was drafted. So there really hasn't been anything but downward movement except for one off season on Trevor Lawrence. But here we are. He's getting Liam Cohen. They have Brian Thomas Jr. Now let's see what they do with Christian Kirk and with Evan Ingram, but they have a number 1 receiver. And what I wanted to highlight in this video is that you are inserting a quarterback that whether you think he's elite or deserve the contract that he got, he's being entered into a situation that last year, a very similar archetype of QB had an awesome offense, and it was an awesome offense for the weapons. Let's take a look at the Trinity here for the Jaguars really quick. And there we go. Oh, that's the last one. I forgot to put that team up yet. Here we go. This should be good when we get to the Jags. And no, Buccaneers. My bad. So looking at the Buccaneers last year, and here they go. This highlights what I was talking about. Look at Chris Godwin and look at Mike Evans, right? Both of them. So this kind of speaks to whoever their wide receiver 2 is, whether it's Christian Kirk, maybe it's Evan Ingram. Who knows? Evan Ingram's more like a slot receiver than he is a tight end. But just looking at the Bucs last year, and obviously Godwin and Evans are one of the best tandems we've ever seen. But still, look at their usage and then look at what they did with it. So yes, they're both very good, but look at the usage. And then look at Cade Otton's usage. Even for the number 3 option on the offense, and this is for the full season. We know what Cade Otton was when Godwin went out. We know what Jalen McMillan was when Godwin went out. So there's Jalen McMillan right here, 3.94 Trinity. But again, what does the above the regression line number tell you? That in this sample size, the player did more with the overall opportunity than expected. So these numbers right here bode very well for whatever the weapons are on top of Brian Thomas in the Jaguars offense. So for that reason, Trevor Lawrence is a buy. The Jaguars are a buy. Fourth, last up, we have the Miami Dolphins and Tua Tagovailoa. And so with Tua, quarterback 24 on Keep Trade Cut, player 83 overall. Fantasy production, okay, Tua actually wasn't bad in points per game last year. I know he missed quite a bit of time with the concussion, but 14th in fantasy points per game last year. But here's where the team stuff gets a little concerning. 26th in neutral pass rate. That is way down from what it was in the past. Now, I don't know why. I'd have to look a little deeper as to why that might have happened. Obviously, Tua missed some time, and so that contributes. This is for the entire season. So if I filtered out the games that he didn't play, maybe that would change it a little bit, but still on the lower end of the league in terms of neutral pass rate. If you look at Tua's efficiency, though, 7th. So when he threw the ball, he was actually very efficient. He's always been there. Now, part of it is people say, well, it's the system. That's what's creating it. But you can't dispute that because Tua's in the system, whether you think he's better or worse in the system or whatever the argument might be, that's the system he's in. He's always been higher in the CPA plus EPOE metric. So I'm going to give him a pass on the quarterback efficiency, meaning that his quarterback efficiency, I think, is pretty stable, where he's going to be efficient on the attempts that they have when he throws. Rushing points. So this is where he's a flaw a little bit, 39th out of 44. So we know he's not going to run. Only 2.7% of his fantasy points were on the ground. So we're probably not getting rushing points for Tua. But again, quarterback 24. So I'm not sitting here saying he's going to finish in the top 5, top 7, top 8, even top 10. But I think if you told me I could get top 15 numbers out of him and I'm paying QB 24 prices, then fine. I'm down with that. Next, let's look at the team. So the Dolphins, the weapons. Obviously, I have them as a buy. Passing points created. This is where it gets really, really interesting. Passing points created. 2nd in the league. Still. Passing points created, still number 2 in the league. Now, this is minus touchdowns. So you can take that as also, was there some touchdown regression that could come or that bit them last year? Because 2nd in the league in production created for the passing game, I don't think people would have thought that. They would have guessed other teams. But that tells me right there that there is still ripe for tons of fantasy points in this offense. 26 in neutral pass rate when they passed. So when the team passed, and this is impressive given that they had backup quarterbacks starting for a third of the season. When the team passed, they were still a little bit above average, 14th in the league in drop back EPA. So if you look deeper at their EPA per play, their run game was what was bad last year, not their passing game. Their passing game wasn't as good as it was the year before, but that's not why their offense was bad. And this number backs it up. When they threw, they were actually pretty decent, a little bit above average. And then play rate, 10th in the league in play rate. So that tells me, combined with the efficiency that Tua has and the team has when they're passing, they still played at a pretty high rate. So really what we need is that neutral pass rate to go up. Part of that could have been the Tyreek Hill injury. Part of that could have been the Tua injury. But I'm willing to bet on this kind of bouncing back in 2025. And again, I'm not saying Tua has a super high ceiling, but there's a lot of quarterback pivot ideas that you potentially could throw in there and go, man, quarterback 24, he's at the very, very bottom of that tier. That's probably not going anywhere. There's probably some other moves I can make if I want to pick up some extra value. So he's the perfect guy to probably try to tier down to. Let's take a look at the Dolphins offense from last year. So obviously we see Tyreek Hill. We see Jalen Waddle. Now, you may say, well, I thought those guys were good. They should be above that regression line. Okay, go back and look at their 2023 where their Trinity was higher and their production was higher. Like, we're not saying Tyreek's going to come back to what he was in 2023. But if he's going to be back, which I think he's going to be back, you're really just betting that Tua can also pick those guys up with the way that they played and with the efficiency that they still maintained last year. Even though those guys had down years, they both dealt with injuries, etc. There's always going to be reasons or excuses. Then you have Jonnu Smith. I mean, Jonnu Smith is the one that benefited from some of the downs with Tua or with Tyreek and Jalen Waddle last year. I mean, a 5.55 Trinity for the season, but if you expand that out to the second half of the year, I mean, he smashed. So I think it's important to kind of keep that kind of stuff in context with the Dolphins. I'm not saying that go buy into the Dolphins. They're going to be one of the best in the league. But I think there's, again, and that's the theme with all of these today, is there has been an overcorrection. There's been an overcorrection in the perception of some of these players. So that's the buys in a nutshell. Brock Purdy, Kyler Murray, Trevor Lawrence, Tua Tagovailoa. Again, check out ddfantasyfootball.com to get access to the Trinity tool. The War tool will be updated very, very shortly with some new features that I will definitely highlight on this show. And if you like the content, like and subscribe to the channel. Hit me up in the comments with any future ideas. And I did want to give a plug. We are going to be doing our season premiere of Destination Chill next Sunday. Myself and Ray are back. We're going to do a 90-minute special episode to kick off the NFL start of free agency, which will be starting the day after. That will be next Sunday night, March the 9th, the day before the legal tampering period starts. So super excited to fire up Destination Chill. Check out all of the rookie draft content and all the other content creators on the channel. Again, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Be chill.